The National Desk, America's News, now.
If you don't have immunity, you just have a ceremonial president.
Does a president have to have immunity? The Supreme Court hears both sides of a case that will impact Donald Trump and possibly all future presidents to come. Descending into chaos, protesters and police clash at college campuses across the country. Just how many states are impacted as the movement grows. Then kicking an opioid addiction, what one group and former addict is doing to lessen the drug's deadly hold on users who fall victim. This is the National Desk, America's News Now. I'm Amira David. Presidential immunity, does it exist? And if so, how far does it go? Those are the questions before the Supreme Court today. Indications show that after 2.5 hours, the justices seem hesitant to allow presidents to be immune from prosecution for things done while in office, signaling they believe a president can't truly be above the law.
I'm not concerned about this case, but I am concerned about future uses of the criminal law to target political opponents based on accusations about their motives.
If there's no threat of criminal prosecution, what prevents the president from just doing whatever he wants?
The justices didn't appear to embrace the idea of total immunity, and it was established that anything that happened beyond the election happened after any official act had taken place, meaning we can more than likely expect that special counsel Jack Smith's January 6th case against Trump will move forward. A decision could come within days, but most likely won't be issued until June. But the timing of the decision is important because if the Supreme Court sends a case back to lower courts, that could push the DOJ's trial against Trump past the November election. If that happens and Trump gets elected, he'd all but certainly kill the case. Donald Trump wasn't in Washington for the high-profile Supreme Court case. He spent the day in a courtroom in New York City. Now a week into a historic trial, national correspondent Christine Frizzell has the latest.
USA! USA! It was an early morning campaign stop. Former President Donald Trump shaking hands with construction workers in New York City ahead of his day back in court.
They've taken my constitutional right away with a gag order. That's all it is. It's election interference. This whole thing is election interference.
Inside the courtroom, former National Enquirer publisher David Pecker back on the stand with a focus on a $150,000 payment the magazine made to former Playboy model Karen McDougal, who claimed she had an affair with Trump, to buy the rights of the story and then bury it, an expense for which Pecker says he was never reimbursed, which later played a role in him ending the deal he had with Michael Cohen.
His testimony is that he did this to help Trump and help the Trump campaign for president in 2016. The theory of the case is there was a conspiracy to interfere with the election to prevent voters from knowing about certain relationships and to pay those folks to keep it quiet.
Pecker also admitting he falsely denied the details in this Wall Street Journal article from 2016, telling the court, quote, "I wanted to protect my company, I wanted to protect myself, and I wanted also to protect Donald Trump." Still, experts say proving any illegal behavior will be difficult.
The Trump team is going to say, the former president didn't keep those books, and that whatever was done, people may not like what was done with paying people off not to talk. That's legal. And that's probably done in campaigns more than we know in this country.
This as another round of legal troubles come from Arizona, where a grand jury indicted 18 Trump allies in a fake electors scheme to prevent the lawful transfer of the presidency in the 2020 election, naming Trump as an unindicted co-conspirator in the case. As far as the hush money case, defense attorneys will certainly have plenty of time for cross-examination of the witnesses. Among them, former fixer Michael Cohen, who hinted he will be taking the stand in a matter of weeks. I'm Christine Frizzell for the National Desk.
More than 400 students have been arrested in the last week as protests at colleges across the country grow. Coast to coast, demonstrators showing discontent with Israel's bombardment of Gaza, continuing their call for a ceasefire, amongst other demands. Tonight, we're tracking new pro-Palestinian protest encampments at Northwestern in Chicago, at Ohio State University. But right now, we're following the heavy police presence and use of force at Emory University in Atlanta. Law enforcement officers were very quick to dismantle an encampment that was put up this morning, prompting violent clashes with protesters. Reports of pepper spray and tasers being used. This video appearing to show someone being tased while under restraint. You can hear the sounds of what appears to be rubber bullets there. Early reports indicating at least a dozen people there have been arrested, including faculty members. We do have video of the chair of the philosophy department being taken into custody. And here's a closer look at just how expansive these pro-Palestinian protests are becoming. At this hour, we're counting at least 26 campuses across 16 different states and also Washington, D.C. that have seen some form of protest in the last 7 days. The wave of activism set off after what demonstrators called a crackdown at Columbia University when protesters were arrested after starting an encampment demanding their school's administration cut all financial ties with Israel. Here's the message from one protester on the University of Texas Austin campus.
Please stop taking our money and giving it to weapons manufacturers. It's not okay with us, and we have a right to make that declaration.
But what protesters say is free speech, elected officials, school administrators, and some Jewish students say has evolved into harassment with claims of anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish rhetoric heard. In the face of protests forming at Florida State and the University of Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis saying he would take harsh actions against any student protesting fellow Jewish students.
At our universities, we're showing you the door. You're going to be expelled when you're doing that stuff.
And new tonight, Harvey Weinstein's 2020 rape conviction has been overturned by a New York appeals court today. The court found the judge the landmark Me Too trial showed prejudice through improper rulings, including letting a woman testify about allegations that weren't part of the case. The court called the errors egregious and said the remedy is a new trial. The 72-year-old former movie mogul has been serving a 23-year sentence. He will remain in prison, however, as he was also convicted in California and was sentenced to 16 years in prison for rape. We are learning new details about a shooting outside of James Bowie High School in Arlington, Texas last night. Arlington police say they have arrested 17-year-old Julian Howard for murder and possession of a controlled substance and ID'd the victim as 18-year-old Atavian Barnes. The officer says Barnes was shot 5 or 6 times and was targeted by the suspect. The two boys are said to have known each other. James Bowie High School was closed today. Annual price increases for all doctors, hospitals, and health insurance companies in California will be limited to 3.5% next year and will fall to just 3% by the year 2029. This comes as California regulators approved a new rule capping rising costs. California residents have been facing almost a 5.5% increase a year for the past 2 decades, with rising salaries closer to 3%. Meanwhile, the cost of living has taken a toll on Americans the past few years, and new research finds it's part of why a majority of adults think key parts of the American dream, buying a home and eventually retiring, are out of reach. National correspondent Atral Nashar has a closer look at the trend.
These days, if you can afford to buy a home, you're in the minority. 78% of aspiring homeowners say they just can't swing it, according to a new Bankrate survey. The top cited reasons: lack of income, high home prices, and not being able to afford a down payment and closing costs.
Even a modest down payment plus the closing costs can be a significant chunk of change. You're talking something well into the 5 figures, even if you're making a modest 3% down payment.
The survey found people in rural areas have a harder time affording a home, reporting lower incomes than those who live in the suburbs and cities.
But what we are seeing is that household earnings are growing faster than inflation. That's a key ingredient to being able to ultimately close that affordability gap.
But it'll take a lot to close the affordability gap on another American dream milestone: retirement. AARP's latest financial security survey found 20% of adults 50 and older have no retirement savings.
It's hugely alarming, and it especially affects people who need those retirement savings the most. About half the workforce in the private sector works for someone that doesn't offer them a retirement benefit.
Even when you factor in those who do have savings, half of adults say they're worried they won't be financially secure when they are able to retire.
Things like the kids' dental bills or the car repair or something like that takes priority over saving for the future.
One bright spot in AARP's findings, a slight uptick in optimism about the future among adults 30 and older, likely due to stabilizing inflation. AARP says here in Washington, there's a lot that policymakers can do to set future retirees up for success, like passing laws that would provide retirement savings accounts to workers who don't get one through their employer, and also make it easier to transfer retirement savings from one job to another. Amira?
All right, Atra, thank you very much for that report. The first cargo ship has passed through the newly opened channel in the Port of Baltimore since the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge. This comes as crews have been working for weeks now to remove the wreckage of the bridge in the Port of Baltimore. The bridge collapsed last month when the cargo ship Dali lost power and ran right into it. At least 6 construction workers on the bridge were killed. New tonight, Southwest Airlines will be leaving 4 airports and will limit new hires. This announcement comes as the airline lost at least $231 million in the first quarter and delayed deliveries of new Boeing planes. Southwest expects to end the year with 2,000 fewer employees. The airline will also stop flights to Syracuse, New York, Bellingham, Washington, and the George Bush Intercontinental Airport in Houston. The Alabama Senate is considering a bill to further limit discussions of gender identity or sexual orientation in public schools. Right now, the law prohibits these discussions up to 5th grade. The legislation just passed by the House would expand this up to 8th grade and would ban certain flags. Critics say it violates First Amendment rights. Supporters say parents should be the ones talking to their kids about these hot topics. Coming up, tens of millions of Americans could see severe weather this week. Which states are at risk for hail, tornadoes, and thunderstorms? Then several people who lost loved ones to overdoses have a new campaign called The Painful Truth, what they're trying to accomplish. And later, an Ohio woman is accused of locking her kids in a shed and feeding them dog food. What she's now being charged with. We'll be right back. We are following a 4-day storm event that will be bringing severe weather across the middle of the United States throughout the weekend. And we're giving you a live look now right over Kansas City, Kansas, says they are in the line for storms ranging from Omaha, Nebraska to Tupelo, Mississippi. We're also keeping an eye on the potential for tornadoes with more severe storms later tonight over Colorado, Kansas, and Nebraska. Now, tomorrow, experts say we'll see more severe weather in the plains as about 37 million people will be in the path of elevated risk for severe weather, and specifically around Omaha, Topeka, and Kansas City, both in Kansas and Missouri, where there will be a 30% chance of hail 2 inches in diameter or larger. Saturday could be the worst of the next few days. More than 50 million people from Texas to Michigan and all states in between are in the line for potentially damaging storms throughout the day. The National Weather Service is predicting a level 3 out of 5 severe thunderstorms, bringing strong wind gusts and hail the size of baseballs. Tornado watches are going to be in effect throughout the plains. And stay with the National Desk online and on air as we continue to track these storms. The U.S. makes up around 4% of the world's population, and it consumes more than 80% of the world's opioids. Mothers Against Prescription Drug Abuse and Aleve have launched a campaign called The Painful Truth. The National Desk's Holly Menino takes a closer look at the campaign and what organizers hope to accomplish.
At 12 years old, Matt Robinson says he was introduced to opioids due to an injury.
And a lot of people are introduced to opioids in this way. We have an injury, we go to a doctor, we're given a prescription, there's not a lot of discussion about it. And before you know it, you're hooked. This was my experience.
Like so many hooked on opioids, his addiction controlled him.
I remember leaving my 5-month-old daughter in the car on Christmas Day while I went upstairs to a drug dealer's house to get pills. This is where it took me.
He says after 10 years of addiction, he checked himself into treatment.
For some reason, here in the U.S., we are prescribed far more opioids than the rest of the world.
In 2011, now former Congresswoman Mary Bono helped create Mothers Against Prescription Drug Abuse with 3 mothers who lost children or loved ones to prescription overdose. In partnership with Aleve, they launched the Painful Truth campaign to encourage people to explore non-addictive pain relief options with their doctor.
I think we should be empowered to simply ask our doctor, what are the options? What are the non-addictive options for me, and where can I get them?
Matt is the voice of the campaign, sharing his story about his own experience and helping others choose a different path from his own.
I deal with a great deal of pain every day. Nothing I can't manage with over-the-counter drugs, rest, ice, holistic methods. I do stretching, I do yoga, physical therapy, non-addictive, non-dangerous or life-threatening methods of pain treatment.
Matt says there still needs to be more conversation around options and alternatives to pain treatment. Holly Menino.
Holly Menino reporting. Stocks are still down following today's news that economic growth was well below expectations last quarter. The GDP inched forward at a 1.6% annualized rate. The Dow, meantime, dropped more than 300 points. We also just learned consumer prices increased more than the previous quarter. These latest numbers have some economists concerned about stagflation. That is when inflation goes up and economic growth slows. Well, the birth rate in the United States, it has declined to a record low. That's according to a new report out of the CDC. Around 3.6 million babies were born last year. That's 2% fewer than the year before. It's similar to the yearly declines seen before the beginning of the COVID pandemic, when there was an increase in new babies. The report also shows birth rates dropped among teens and younger women and went up for women in their 30s and 40s. Coal and new natural gas power plants will have to reduce or capture 90% of their climate pollution by the year 2032. That's due to new rules finalized today. The EPA also announced stricter rules for toxic wastewater, coal ash, and mercury emitted from smokestacks. The agency expects the changes will drastically cut the sector's carbon emissions. Net neutrality rules are back. The FCC voted today to reinstate the Obama-era regulation prohibiting internet providers from blocking or slowing down certain websites. The agency will also have the ability to investigate internet outages and treat service providers as utilities. Broadband providers will probably sue over this decision. New research shows your diet and few other activities that challenge the brain may help fight off Alzheimer's disease. Medical reporter Liz Bonis shares some food for thought.
Hey everybody, the Alzheimer's Association says 3 diets now appear to help provide food for thought, you might say. But the foods need to be combined with a few other healthy brain habits.
At the Brains in Bloom event for family members and friends connected to Alzheimer's disease, the flower arranging and socialization, one healthy brain habit, especially for Terry Thomas and her mom.
I get to see her be happy and thriving and just get out and mingle with other people, socialize, and just have a really good time.
Activities like this are mentally challenging. Activities like this are physically challenging. Both are critical to keeping memory and thinking strong, Adam Ortman told me. He specializes in exercise science at Ohio's Activate Brain and Body.
Physical activity and inflammation are 2 things that are becoming more prominent, where most of the roots for illnesses and diseases stem from a lack of physical activity or exercise and inflammation. So if we can do things to increase activity and decrease inflammation, generally these symptoms are going to be less and you're going to feel better and have better health.
Add to that one of the 3 diets now recommended by the Alzheimer's Association, and you really have a formula for long-term brain health success. The first is the DASH diet. It's dietary approaches to stop hypertension. It focuses on fruits and vegetables and a plant-based diet, along with 3-a-day dairy. The second is the Mediterranean diet. It suggests seafood instead of red meat, as well as good fats such as olive oil and fruits and vegetables. And finally, the MIND diet is a combo of these 2. It suggests berries and a lot of green leafy vegetables, along with other plant-based foods. Those who eat this way, one study found, reduced the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease by more than 50% compared to those who eat the more traditional high-fat, meat-based diet.
That was Liz Bonis reporting. Coming up, thousands of people are heading to a mullet toss in Florida this weekend to raise money for charity. Why PETA has taken issue with the event. We have reporters all across the country in your neighborhoods covering the issues that matter most to you. We're taking the pulse of America.
Cuffed and shackled, Christelle Fuller in a Delaware County courtroom, facing a serious list of charges, including abuse, child endangerment, and obstruction of justice. She and her husband, Jason Fuller, arrested at their home last week, accused of abusing their own children, all 7 of them.
I had always in the back of my mind thought something wasn't quite right.
Neighbors I spoke with say they can't believe what investigators say was going on right next door. Court documents indicate the couple was arrested after a complaint was filed with the Delaware County Job and Family Services Department, accusing the couple of locking one of their children in a shed and feeding them dog food.
Looking for a small miracle. That's the title of John and Lynn's advertisement in the local paper. The first line reads, older Maine couple, wife disabled, will be homeless by May 1st.
We have good credit, we have money, but that doesn't seem to be enough nowadays.
The Yarmouth couple has been searching for a place to call home for the last 6 months. Right now, they're renting this place from a family who temporarily moved to Morocco. May 1st is when that family moves back. John's wife, Lynn, is what he describes as somewhat disabled.
I can live in a tent, but she can't.
After a stroke and 2 months in a coma, Lynn needs help walking, needs a caregiver and extensive help, as well as an accessible place to live.
It's been happening for 40 years, the mullet toss at the Floribama.
Mainly the crowd, the people, it's a good time.
Thousands of people will be heading to the Floribama this weekend, throwing mullet and raising money for local youth charities on both sides of the state line. Jennifer Parnell with Floribama says they raise around $40,000 every year.
It's our biggest weekend of the year.
Some backlash from the event from animal rights group PETA, which says it would rather see participants throwing rubber fish instead of dead fish. A man who has participated in the mullet toss twice calls PETA's claims a little ridiculous and tone-deaf, considering all the money that the event raises.
I mean, the fish are dead. I've never heard anybody having a problem with throwing a fish. Just let it be. It's not hurting anything.
And a live look right now at downtown Detroit. You can see all those people getting ready in just about an hour and a half. The NFL draft is taking center stage. This is the first time Motown has ever hosted the NFL's marquee offseason event. The Chicago Bears, that team will have the first pick tonight beginning at 8 p.m. Eastern as teams go through the first round. Rounds 2 and 3 will be held tomorrow night, followed by the final 4 rounds on Saturday. Happy draft watching to you. And that does it for this edition of the National Desk. I'm Amira David. Thank you so much for watching.